London, November 1872. In a small office on the upper floor of the British Museum, a man named George Smith is leaning over a fragment of clay, no larger than the palm of a hand. He is 32 years old. He left school at 14. He apprenticed as a banknote engraver. He taught himself to read cuneiform on his lunch breaks, alone, from books in the British Museum reading room. He has no university degree. He never will. In front of him, on a piece of green felt, lie the pieces of a tablet brought back from Nineveh, decades earlier by Hormuzd Rassam, who worked under Austin Henry Layard. The fragments have been sitting in storage. Smith has been sorting them, piece by piece, for years. This evening in the lamplight he reads a passage he was not expecting. A boat, a flood, a man told by a god to build the boat and save the seeds of every living thing. A dove released to find dry land. It is the story of Noah, written on clay, at least 1,000 years older than the Book of Genesis. Smith stood up from his desk. According to the recollection of his colleagues, he removed his coat in a gesture they never quite understood. He ran around the room. 2 weeks later, on December 3rd, 1872, he presented the tablet to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London. The Prime Minister, William Gladstone, was in the audience. The next morning, newspapers across Europe carried the discovery. The Daily Telegraph subscribed funds for an expedition. Smith would return to Nineveh, find the missing fragments, and die in Aleppo of dysentery before he turned 36. This is where our story begins, not with the flood, but with what came before the flood. Because on the same clay surfaces where Smith read about the deluge, other texts spoke of something stranger. They described a council of beings who descended from the sky. They described a younger generation of labouring gods who grew tired and revolted. They described the creation of humanity, not from love, not from cosmic accident, but from a problem the senior gods needed solved. The Sumerians called these beings the Anunnaki. The name itself is a Sumerian compound. Anunna, the seed of the prince, the offspring of An, the sky god whose own name simply meant heaven. There is a modern claim, popularized in the late 20th century, that the Anunnaki made humanity for one specific purpose: to mine their gold, to work the veins of the earth on behalf of beings who needed the metal for reasons the texts never quite explain. It is a claim repeated in millions of books, in millions of videos. It is a claim that has taken on a life of its own. Tonight we are going to walk through what the tablets actually say, slowly, with patience. We will look at the question of why the Sumerians said humanity was made. We will examine the gold hypothesis with care, and we will sit with what the cuneiform record permits us to know, and what it does not. This is for those who keep wondering if the history they have been taught is complete. For wanderers, for curious minds. The clay has waited 4,000 years to be read this carefully. We can take our time with it. Now let us begin where the Sumerians said it all began. Eridu. The name is preserved in the cuneiform of an old Babylonian scribe on a clay prism that stands today in a glass case in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Catalogue number 1923. The prism was recovered from the ruins of Larsa, modern Tel Senkera, in southern Iraq in 1922, under the funding of an Oxford collector named Herbert Weld Blundell. It stands about 20 centimetres tall. It is four-sided. It is covered on every face with neat lines of cuneiform. It is, as Thorkild Jacobson of the University of Chicago established in his definitive 1939 edition for the Assyriological Studies series, the most complete extant copy of what scholars call the Sumerian king list. The opening line of the prism, in transliteration, reads, Nam Lugal Anta Eddeaba. In English, when kingship was lowered from heaven. It then names a city, Eridu. The Sumerian king list is one of the strangest documents to survive from the ancient world. It is on its surface a simple chronicle, a list of kings, the cities they ruled from, and the lengths of their reigns. It begins before the flood, and it continues into the historical period, where the dynasties of Ur and Akkad and Isin are kings we can locate in archaeology, in dated inscriptions in the material record. But the antediluvian section, the kings who reigned before the flood, contains numbers that ought to stop a reader cold. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, reigned 28,800 years. Enmenlu Ana, of Bad Tibera reigned 43,200 years. The total reign of the 8 kings of the 5 antediluvian cities on the Weld-Blundell prism is 241,200 years. The number is not a copying error. It is preserved across multiple manuscript variants. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek for the court of Antiochus I around 281 BCE, gave a slightly different list, with a total of 432,000 years across 10 kings. That number, 432,000, would appear later on the other side of the Hindu Kush in the Sanskrit calculation of the Kali Yuga. There is something in this arithmetic that has bothered scholars for over a century. The numbers are too specific to be poetic license. They follow a sexagesimal logic, the base 60 mathematics the Sumerians invented, the same mathematics that still divides our hours into 60 minutes and our minutes into 60 seconds. The number 28,800 is precisely 8 units of 3,600. The Sumerian Shah, the great cosmic period that recurs throughout their texts. It is too long to be flattery to a living king. The kings named are too distant. It is too consistent across recensions to be a mistake. The numbers are doing something. We are not yet sure what. Now, the city itself, Eridu. For 2.5 millennia after Sumer fell, Eridu existed only as a name in Mesopotamian myth. No European had walked through its ruins. No one knew with certainty where it had been. Then, in 1855, a British vice-consul named J.E. Taylor crossed the southern marshes of what was then Ottoman Iraq and arrived at a site the local Bedouin called Tel Abu Shahrain, the mound of the father of 2 months. He spent a brief season there, made a sketch map, and left. For nearly 100 years, the site was not properly touched. In 1946, 2 archaeologists working for the newly independent Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities arrived in the region. Their names were Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd. Safar was an Iraqi scholar trained at the University of Chicago. Lloyd was an Englishman who had spent the previous decade excavating across northern Mesopotamia. Together between 1946 and 1949, they opened the surface of Tel Abu Shahrain. What they found there extended the timeline of human civilization. Beneath the surface of the mound, in 18 distinct stratigraphic layers, they uncovered 6 superimposed temples. Each had been built on top of the last. Each had been dedicated to the same god. His name was Enki. The deepest temple they reached, level 18, dated to approximately 5,400 years before the Common Era, 7,000 years before our own time. Eridu was older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the wheel. The Sumerian tradition had been correct. Eridu was the first city. What Safar and Lloyd found there was not the kind of evidence that travels easily in headlines. There were no gold masks, there were no painted murals. There were the bricks of a temple, stacked carefully on top of each other across 3,000 years. There were the bones of fish, offered at the altar of a water god. There were small clay figurines, no taller than a finger, of beings that were not entirely human in their proportions. It is worth pausing on this. The Sumerians of 3000 BCE remembered Eridu as the first city. The archaeology of the 20th century confirmed it. The continuity of cultural memory across that span of time, from 5400 BCE to the historical period, is one of the strangest things in our species' record. These were people who remembered. Imagine, for a moment, what it took to keep that name alive. From a settlement of mud brick huts on the edge of the Persian Gulf in 5400 BCE, through the rise of Uruk, through the dynasties of Lagash and Akkad, through the empire of Sargon, through the kings of Ur, through the kings of Babylon, through 5,000 years of war and conquest and language change. The name Eridu survived all of it. The first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven. Picture then the work in the summer of 1947. The light over the marshes is white and hot. Safar in a linen suit, Lloyd in shirt sleeves taking notes. A workman climbs out of the trench. He is holding something small in his hand. A foundation tablet, cuneiform, badly worn, but legible enough. It names Enki, the god of fresh water, the god of wisdom, the god who, according to texts that would only be properly unearthed and translated across the second half of the 20th century, designed humanity from the clay of the Abzu and gave us the breath of intelligence. The same god who, according to the Atrahasis epic, warned Ziusudra of the coming flood and instructed him to build the boat that George Smith would read about, in cuneiform, on a fragment from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, on a November evening in London in 1872. The lines of transmission are long, the lines of transmission are unbroken. The clay outlasted the empire that fired it. To understand what the tablets describe, we have to leave Eridu for a moment and follow the texts themselves, north and forward in time, to the libraries of old Babylonian Sippar and to the great archive at Nineveh, where most of the Anunnaki literature survived. The earliest written references to the Anunnaki appear in Sumerian compositions from the 3rd millennium BCE. Their fullest literary treatment, however, comes from the Old Babylonian period, roughly 1900 to 1600 years before the Common Era. This is the period that produced the great cosmological texts that survive most completely. The Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, the composition known to scholars as Enki and Ninmah. In these works, the Anunnaki are the senior gods. They are the decree makers. They are the offspring of An, the sky, and they sit in council and determine the fates of cities, of kings, and of the world. Beneath them there is a second class of divine beings. Their name is the Igigi. The word is etymologically opaque, even to Akkadian linguists. We do not know exactly where it comes from. We know what they did. The Igigi were the labouring younger gods. They were the ones who dug the canals. They were the ones who tilled the floodplain. They were the ones who carried the tupshiku, the labour basket, on their backs. The word tupshiku is one of the most important words in the entire creation story. It denotes a specific tool, a woven carrying basket used to move soil and brick. It is the symbol throughout Mesopotamian literature of unwanted physical labour. According to Tablet 1 of the Atrahasis epic, in the canonical translation produced by Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard in 1969 for the Oxford Clarendon Press, the Igigi laboured under the tupshiku for 3,600 years. That number, 3,600, is one Shah, one great Sumerian cosmic period. They dug the bed of the Tigris. They dug the bed of the Euphrates. They carried the basket until their hands were ruined and their backs were broken. And then one night, they revolted. They set fire to their tools. They marched on Ekur, the temple of Enlil, in the city of Nippur. They demanded relief. The senior gods, the Anunnaki, convened a council. They had a genuine problem. The work had to be done. The land had to be irrigated. Someone had to carry the basket. But the Igigi would no longer carry it. Mami, the mother goddess, also called Nintu, also called Belet Il, the lady of the gods, stepped forward with a solution. She said, in the translation, Lambert and Millard recovered, "Let me create a substitute. Let me make a creature that can bear the yoke in place of the Igigi." She called this creature Lulu, the Akkadian word for primitive man, the first form of humanity, before language, before settlement, before the long tradition that would eventually write itself down in clay. And here, in this scene, is the line that has caused a century of careful argument among Assyriologists. A god is slaughtered. His name is Wi-Ilu, or Geshtu-e, or in one variant, Ilawela. He is a minor god. His significance is not in his power, but in his name. The Sumerian syllable Geshtu means hearing, or understanding, or intelligence. The Akkadian element Temu, embedded in the variant name through a pun, means reason, or plan, or thought. Mami takes the flesh of this minor god. She takes his blood. She mixes them with clay drawn from the Absu, the freshwater abyss beneath Enki's temple at Eridu. From this mixture, she shapes the first human beings. The Atrahasis text states it plainly. From the flesh and the blood of the slain god, his ghost spirit, his Atemu, remains within the human creature. The human carries the intelligence of the divine inside a body of clay. Let that thought sit with you. The earliest detailed written account of human origins in the historical record is not a story about being made in the image of a single benevolent creator. It is a story about a council of gods who needed labour. It is a story about a sacrifice. And it is a story in which something divine, something rational, something self-aware, was deliberately placed inside a body of clay, so that the body could perform the work the gods themselves no longer wished to do. The question that hangs over this scene, the question we will return to throughout this story, is not whether the Sumerians believed it. We know they did. The texts were copied and recopied for over 1,000 years. They were buried in temple libraries. They were preserved with the care a civilization gives to what it considers true. The question is what they were actually describing. The question is whether the work that humanity was created to do was simply the work of the field and the canal, as the words of the text suggest at first reading, or whether, as a modern interpretation has proposed with increasing confidence, the work was something else entirely. To answer that question, or even to sit with it honestly, we first have to understand what the Sumerians meant by labour. We have to understand what the work actually looked like. We have to understand the soil and the water, and the long memory of a people who lived inside a landscape that demanded constant maintenance simply to remain habitable. Now, let us descend to the floodplain. The land we call Sumer was a strip of alluvium roughly 400 kilometres long and 150 kilometres wide, lying between the lower courses of the Tigris and the Euphrates. It lies today in the southeastern corner of Iraq. In the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era, when the earliest cities were rising, the Persian Gulf extended much further inland than it does today. Eridu, when it was founded around 5400 BCE, sat on the edge of a coastal marsh. Ur and Uruk, in their early periods, were essentially lagoon cities. The geography was wet and salt and difficult. The major settlements rose along the river courses and the marshland margins. Eridu first, then Ur and Uruk in the next stage, then Lagash, Larsa, Nippur and the others, each in its turn. By the time the cuneiform record begins in earnest, the southern alluvium held perhaps a dozen city-states, each with its own patron deity, each with its own ziggurat, each with its own canal network and grain accounts. The Sumerians called the region Kalam, the homeland. The Akkadians, who came later from the north, called it Shumeru, from which we get the word Sumer. The land itself, the actual soil under the cities, was made by the rivers. The cultural memory of this fact, that the place itself was a deposit, that it had been created by patient sedimentation across many millennia, seems to have been preserved in the texts. The soil itself was extraordinary. The two rivers, in their annual spring flood, deposited a layer of mineral-rich silt that could support cereal agriculture at densities seen nowhere else on Earth at that time. The yields, according to the calculations Robert McCormick Adams worked out in his 1981 study, Heartland of Cities, were among the highest in the ancient world. This is what made the cities possible. This is what gave the temples grain to count, and priests something to record. This is what allowed the first writing system in human history to come into being, sometime around 3200 BCE, on small clay tablets used for tracking the inflow and outflow of agricultural products in the storehouses of Uruk. The problem, however, was the irrigation. The floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rise in the wrong season for the grain. The water peaks in late spring, after the snowmelt in the mountains of Anatolia, at the moment when the barley has already been planted and is in its heading phase. Left to itself, the river drowns the crop just as it is ripening. To grow grain on this land, you have to capture the spring flood in canals and basins. You have to lift the stored water onto the fields in late summer. You have to drain the salt-laden water back away before it poisons the soil and ruins the harvest of the following year. This is the work the Igigi were said to have done. The Atrahasis epic describes the labour with a kind of bureaucratic precision that has surprised modern readers. The younger gods were given the task of digging the channel of the Tigris and the channel of the Euphrates. They were given the further task of cutting the side canals, the Eid in Sumerian, the network of irrigation channels that fed the fields. They worked, the text says, by day and by night for 3,600 years. The text is graphic about the toll. Their hands were torn. Their shoulders were ruined. They cursed the soil that they were carving. It is worth pausing on this image. Most Mesopotamian descriptions of physical labour are formal, restrained, almost gentle in their framing. The Igigi passage is not. The Igigi passage reads like an account of forced labour at industrial scale. The translation Lambert and Millard published for Oxford in 1969 preserves the texture of the original language. The repeated word for basket, the repeated word for burden, the repeated word for back. There is a flavour to the verbs that is not mythological. It is closer to administrative testimony. What were they actually digging? In the literal reading, they were digging the rivers themselves. They were carving the geography of southern Mesopotamia. They were preparing the floodplain before there were any humans, so that when humans arrived, they would inherit a land already prepared for agriculture. The text is telling us in the language of myth that the inhabitable world had to be made before it could be inhabited. The canals had to be cut before the fields could be sown. The order of southern Iraq, the order that allowed the cities to rise, was not the work of nature alone. There is a second version of the creation, recorded on a different set of tablets, that adds a further dimension to this picture. It is a Sumerian composition known to modern scholars as Enki and Ninmah. It survives in fragmentary Old Babylonian copies. It has been transliterated and translated in its definitive composite form by the ETCSL project at Oxford, the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, under composition number 1.1.2. In this version, the senior gods An, Enlil, and Enki are resting. The minor gods, the lesser deities, are complaining. They are crushing the clay. They are carrying the labour basket. They are weary. The text uses the same vocabulary as the Atrahasis epic. It uses the word tupshiku. It uses the verb for digging. It uses the language of complaint and fatigue. In this version, however, it is not the slain god Wi'ilu whose flesh and blood become humanity. It is Nama, the primeval sea, who wakes Enki from his sleep. She rouses him in the Abzu, in his temple at Eridu, and she presents the problem. The lesser gods are suffering. The work cannot continue. Something has to be done. Enki, in this version, devises the solution himself. He instructs Nama. He tells her to draw clay from the surface of the Abzu, from the freshwater abyss, and to shape it with the help of the womb goddess Ninmah, who is also called Aruru in some recensions. The text states that Enki provides the design. He decides the form. He sets the limbs and the joints and the proportions. He instructs Ninmah to give the new creature the burden of the gods. And then the text turns strange. After the first humans are created, Enki and Ninmah hold a drinking feast. They become drunk. In their drunkenness, Ninmah challenges Enki. She says that she can shape a human in any form she wishes, and that Enki will have to find a use for whatever she makes. Enki accepts the challenge. Ninmah then produces a series of malformed humans. A man who cannot bend his outstretched hands. A man who cannot close his eyes against the light. A woman who cannot bear children. A creature with no functioning sex at all. For each one, Enki, by his cleverness, decrees a fate. He gives them a place in the society of human beings. The man who cannot bend his hands becomes a court attendant. The man who cannot close his eyes becomes a musician. The barren woman becomes a member of the queen's harem. The text then reverses the contest. Enki, in his turn, produces a being of his own. The tablet is fragmentary in this section, but what survives indicates a creature shaped in some kind of extreme incapacity, a being that Ninmah cannot find a function for. For this being, no fate can be decreed. The lesson seems to be that there is a limit to what even the cleverness of the gods can place into a working society. Some forms exist, the text suggests, beyond the bounds of any decreed purpose. Some lives exceed the cosmic order's capacity to assign them a role. The text presents this entire sequence as a kind of cosmic comedy. The gods are inventing the categories of human existence by trial and error, while drunk at a feast. Let that thought sit with you. The earliest creation narrative in the world does not present human origins as perfect. It presents them as iterative. It presents them as improvised. It presents disability and difference not as defects, but as features the designers had to find a place for, after the fact, by the cleverness of the god of wisdom. There is a humility in this that the Sumerians seem to have kept, even into their late period. They did not present their own creation as flawless. They presented it as something arrived at, by stages, in moments of need. Now let us return to Enki himself. He is one of the most important characters in the story, and he is also one of the most consistently misread. In English language popular discussion of the Anunnaki, Enki is sometimes presented as a rebel, a renegade, a god who broke with his senior peers to advocate for humanity. The texts, when read carefully, do not quite support this picture. They show something more layered. Enki, in the Sumerian sources, is the god of fresh water. His name is sometimes etymologized as Enki, Lord of the Earth. Akkadian renderings often translate his name as Ea, with a different and more disputed meaning. His domain is the Abzu, which in Sumerian cosmology was the freshwater sea that lay beneath the surface of the earth, the source of springs and wells, the underground reservoir from which fresh water rose to the world above. The Sumerians believed, with what appears to have been quiet seriousness, that beneath the dry plain of Eridu there was a hidden sea of fresh water, and that the temple of Enki sat on its surface, and that the god dwelt within it. When Safar and Lloyd excavated the temple at Eridu in the late 1940s, they found in the levels beneath the surface an unusual feature. The temple at Eridu was built in such a way that fresh groundwater seeped up through its lower foundations. The building was literally moist on its lowest courses from the seepage of subterranean water. Whether this was deliberate, whether the priests of Eridu had chosen this particular location precisely because of the high water table, or whether the geography itself had given rise to the theology, the archaeology cannot fully decide. But the result is striking. The god of fresh water lived in a temple where fresh water came up out of the ground. The myth and the geology corresponded. Enki is also the god of craft. He is the patron of artisans, of canal builders, of metallurgists, of magicians. In the literature, he is the deity to whom humans appeal when they have a technical problem, when they want a fluke of luck, when they need to outsmart an opponent. He is associated, in particular, with the me, the divine principles or decrees that govern civilized life. The Sumerian myth Inanna and Enki describes how the goddess Anunna travels to Eridu, gets Enki drunk at a feast, and persuades him to give her the me one by one. She carries them back to Uruk in a boat. Enki, when he sobers up, tries to retrieve them, but fails. The pattern that emerges from these texts is consistent. He is shrewd. He is patient. He is fond of feasts and of long conversation. He is the god who solves problems by indirection rather than by force. He is also the god who, again and again, takes humanity's side when the senior council moves against it. When Enlil, the storm god, the chief executive of the divine assembly, grows angry with humanity and resolves to destroy it with the flood, it is Enki who whispers a warning to Atrahasis through the wall of a reed hut. The text takes care to note that Enki does not directly violate his oath to keep the divine plan secret. He addresses the wall. The wall, in turn, addresses Atrahasis. The clever evasion is preserved in the language of the tablet, and it is one of the most beautiful sentences in the entire corpus of cuneiform literature. What if this is not merely literary cleverness? What if the tradition is recording, in the language of its own theological grammar, an actual disagreement among the parties responsible for creation? The text gives us a council of beings who do not entirely agree on what their creatures are for. Some want them destroyed, one wants them warned. A god who breaks his oath through a wall of reeds is a god who is on the side of the creatures he designed. And it is here that the story begins to widen. Because Enki is not the only divine figure who took a personal interest in humanity. According to a separate tradition, preserved across several cuneiform sources from the Old Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian periods, Enki sent 7 sages, the apkallu, up from the Abzu to teach humanity the arts of civilization. They came before the flood. They taught the kings of the antediluvian cities. They were not, the texts say, entirely human in their form. The sources for this tradition are scattered. We find references in the Babylonian historian Berossus, who wrote in Greek for the Hellenistic court of Antiochus I around 281 BCE. We find references in the late cuneiform compilation, known as the Catalogue of Texts and Authors, preserved in fragments from Ashurbanipal's library. We find references in Neo-Assyrian magical and ritual texts, where the apkallu are invoked as guardian figures, their images carved into clay and buried at the corners of houses. The most extensive description survives in a composition called Biet Messeri, edited by the German Assyriologist Reichel Borger in 1974 for the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. The 7 sages are named there. Their birth from the Abzu, their service to the kings of the antediluvian cities, their return to the sea after the flood, all of this is laid out in formal language that the Mesopotamian tradition preserved with patience across more than 1,000 years. Let us hold that name for a moment, wanderer. Apkallu. We will return to it. The word breaks into 2 parts in Sumerian. Ab, meaning great, vast, deep. Gal, meaning sage or wise one. Abgal, the great sages. The Akkadian rendering preserves the same idea. Apkallu, a figure of high wisdom, a figure associated with depth and with water, a figure who, in the Mesopotamian imagination, stood at the very beginning of human civilization, in the period before the flood, when the cities of the antediluvian world were still being founded. There were 7 of them. The number is consistent across the tradition. 7 apkallu, 1 for each of the 7 antediluvian cities, or 1 for each of the 7 first kings. The Mesopotamians worked, as we have already seen, in a sexagesimal arithmetic. They counted by 6s and by 10s and by 60s. The number 7 in their system carried a particular weight. It was the number of the planets visible to the unaided eye, including the sun and the moon. It was the number of the Pleiades, the small cluster that hung at the edge of their winter sky. It was a number reserved for completeness, for ritual closure, for the 7 steps of a ziggurat. 7 apkallu, 1 for each foundational city. The first of them, in most lists, was named Uan, or in the Greek transliteration that comes down to us through Berossus, Oans. He arrived, according to the tradition preserved by the Babylonian priest in his Babyloniaca, from the sea. The fragmentary description that survives in the later compilations of Alexander Polyhistor and Eusebius of Caesarea is one of the strangest passages in the entire corpus of ancient writing. Oans, Berossus tells us, had the body of a fish, but under the head of the fish there was a second head, a human head. He had feet like a man beneath the tail of the fish. He had a human voice. He arrived in the Persian Gulf during the day, walked on dry land, taught the people the arts of civilization, and at sunset returned into the water. He taught them writing. He taught them the construction of cities. He taught them the keeping of laws, the cultivation of grain, the working of metal, the building of temples. When the day was finished, he gave them a written record of what he had taught. And then the text says simply, he went back into the sea. After Oannes, the tradition continues, came 6 more apkallu. They appeared in the reigns of the next 6 antediluvian kings. They taught the same arts in the same way. And then after the 7th of them, the flood came, and the apkallu returned to the sea, and the line of sages was succeeded by a different lineage, the line of the Umanu, the human scholars, who would carry the knowledge forward by their own efforts without divine assistance. This is the tradition, as Berossus recorded it for the Greek-speaking world in the 3rd century before the Common Era. But Berossus was not making it up. He was transmitting a tradition that had been preserved in the cuneiform corpus for a very long time before him. The same 7 apkallu, with the same names, appear in the magical and ritual texts of the Neo-Assyrian period. They appear in the apotropaic ceremonies described in the composition Bit Mezeri, in which small clay figures of the 7 sages were buried at the foundations of houses to protect against demons. They appear in the king lists from late Uruk, where each antediluvian king is paired with a corresponding apkallu, and the pairings then continued into historical times, with each later king matched to his umanu, his human scholar, as if the tradition wished to insist that the line had never been broken. They are depicted in Assyrian palace reliefs, carved into the walls of Nimrud and Nineveh, by sculptors who worked under Ashurnasirpal II and his successors. The image is unmistakable, a figure with a human body, a human head, but draped in a fish cloak so that the open mouth of the fish forms a kind of hood above the brow, and the body of the fish hangs down the back like a long robe. They hold a small bucket. They carry a cone. They appear to be sprinkling something, performing a ritual purification of the king or of a sacred tree. The iconography travelled. The same fish-cloaked figure appears in Phoenician art along the Levantine coast. The same figure appears, in modified form, in early Mediterranean priestly costume, in details whose continuity has been debated by Assyriologists and historians of religion for over a century. The connection need not detain us here. What we should hold is that the image of a hybrid teacher, half aquatic, half human, persisted in the visual memory of the ancient Near East for thousands of years. Now let us consider what the tradition is actually saying. It is saying that civilization, in its first form, did not arise from below. It is saying that the arts of cities, of writing, of agriculture, of law, of metallurgy, were not invented by humans in a slow process of trial and error. They were given, complete, by a series of 7 beings who came from the water, who were not entirely human in their form, who taught what they knew during the day and return to the sea at night. There is a phrase that the cuneiform tradition uses for these arts. The phrase is the me. We met it briefly when we spoke of Anunna and Enki. The me, in Sumerian, are the divine principles, the decrees, the templates that govern every aspect of civilized existence. There is a me for kingship. There is a me for priesthood. There is a me for music. There is a me for the office of the scribe. There is a me for the building of cities. There is a me for the rules of war and the rules of peace. The me, according to the tradition, were held originally by Enki in his temple at Eridu. They were the property of the freshwater god of the Abzu. And it was through Enki, through his messengers the apkallu, that the me were transmitted to humanity. The text in Anunna and Enki lists more than 100 of these decrees. The list is methodical. Lordship, godship, the exalted throne, the exalted scepter, the shepherd's staff, the crown, the truth, the descent to the netherworld, the ascent from the netherworld, the art of the cult priest, the art of the lamentation priest, the art of the libation, the art of the scribe, the art of the metal worker, the art of the leather worker, the art of the carpenter, the art of the builder. Each of these, the text says, was kept in the Abzu of Eridu and was transmitted from there. The implication is striking. The Sumerians believed that civilization did not emerge from their own ingenuity. They believed it was given. They believed it had a source. They believed the source was a god of fresh water who lived beneath the surface of a southern marsh, who employed a series of messengers, and who released the templates of civilized life one by one as humans were prepared to receive them. It is worth pausing on this because the contrast with our modern self-understanding could not be sharper. We tend to assume civilization is a human achievement. We assume writing was figured out, gradually, by accountants who needed a way to track grain. We assume agriculture was discovered, gradually, by hunter-gatherers who noticed which seeds sprouted near their middens. We assume the technologies that made cities possible were the slow accumulation of countless anonymous adjustments across thousands of years. The Sumerians thought differently. They thought the things had been handed down. They thought there had been teachers. What moves me about the apkallu tradition, when I sit with it in the quiet of an evening, is how stubbornly it survived. The Sumerians preserved it. The Akkadians preserved it. The Babylonians preserved it. The Assyrians, 1,000 years after the first cuneiform tablets, were still carving fish-cloaked figures into the walls of their royal palaces, still burying small clay sages at the corners of their houses, still naming the apkallu in their lists of pre-flood teachers. Berossus preserved it for the Greeks preserved it for the Romans. And here we are, 2,500 years after Berossus, still trying to understand what the tradition was trying to tell us. Let us hold one further detail before we move on. Among the arts that the apkallu were said to have taught was metallurgy. It is listed plainly in the texts, the art of the metal worker, the working of copper, the working of bronze, the working, above all, of gold. And this brings us, at last, to the question that gives this story its title. Now let us speak of gold. The Sumerians were, by any reasonable measure, a people who valued gold to an extraordinary degree. The temples of Eridu and Ur and Uruk and Nippur were sheathed in it. The crowns of the kings were made of it. The funerary masks of the queens, when Leonard Woolley excavated the royal tombs of Ur between 1922 and 1934, came up out of the ground in such quantities and such workmanship that the British Museum and the Penn Museum had to invent new categories of cataloguing for them. The headdress of Queen Puabi, alone, recovered from grave PG 800 in the third season of the excavation, contained more wrought gold than most modern national treasuries would willingly display in a single case. And here is the strange thing. There is no gold in Sumer. Southern Mesopotamia is an alluvial plain. It is built of silt deposited by the two rivers across many millennia. It has no mountains. It has no exposed bedrock. It has no veins. The only metals that exist in the soil of southern Iraq are the trace minerals carried down from the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates, and these are present in quantities far too small to be commercially exploited. If you want gold in Sumer, you have to bring it in. You have to import it. You have to send caravans or ships or armed expeditions to faraway places, and you have to negotiate, or you have to fight for what they hold. The texts tell us where the gold came from. It came from the east, from the highlands of what is now Iran. It came from Meluha, which most modern scholars identify with the Indus Valley civilization, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. It came from Dilmun, which is modern Bahrain, an entrepot where goods from further east were transshipped to the head of the Persian Gulf. It came from the south, from the mountainous regions of what is now Yemen and Oman. It came in smaller quantities from Egypt, by way of the Levantine coast. And it came, in a particular and persistent literary tradition, from a place called Arata. The Sumerian text Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, preserved in old Babylonian copies and edited in its definitive form for the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, describes a long competition between the king of Uruk, Enmerkar, and an unnamed lord of Arata. The competition concerns the supply of gold, silver, and lapis lazuli for the temple of Anunna at Uruk. Enmerkar demands these materials from Arata. The lord of Arata resists. The two kings exchange increasingly elaborate riddles and challenges through a single exhausted messenger who has to memorize each message and carry it back across the 7 mountain ranges that separate the two cities. The location of Arata has never been securely identified. The text says it lies far to the east, beyond 7 mountain passes, in a region rich in precious materials. Modern scholarship has variously placed it in Iranian Azerbaijan, in the Zagros, in the Hindu Kush, even as far away as the Sistan Basin. What the text consistently says is that Arata has what Uruk needs, and that what Uruk needs is, above all, the metals. There is another text. It is called Lugal-e, or Ninurta's Exploits. It is composed in a high heroic style. It describes the war between the god Ninurta and the Asag, a chaos monster who lives in the mountains. Ninurta defeats the Asag, and in the aftermath of the battle, the text turns to the question of the stones and metals of the mountain. Ninurta decrees their fates. He sets the order in which they will be valued and used by humans. And among the materials he names, named in formal sequence, is the gold of a place called Harali. Harali is mentioned in only a small number of cuneiform sources, but its identity in those texts is consistent. It is a distant mountain land. It is the source of the finest gold. The gold of Harali is what the temple jewelers of Sumer and Babylon used when they wanted to make something at the very top of the possible standard. We do not know where Harali was. Some scholars have placed it in eastern Iran. Some have placed it in the mountains south of the Caspian. Some have suggested it lay further east, perhaps in what is now Afghanistan. The Japanese Assyriologist Fumi Karahashi, who studied the geographical references in Lugali in detail in a 2004 article for the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, concluded only that Harali lay in the high country beyond the eastern frontier of the cuneiform world. What the texts make clear is that the Sumerians had a clear conception of where their gold came from. They knew it came from mountains they themselves did not control. They knew the gold had to be brought down by labour, by trade, by war. They knew that someone, somewhere, was digging it out of the rock and carrying it back to the cities of the plain. The texts also make clear that the gold was not, in the Sumerian conception, a merely human appetite. The gold belonged first and foremost to the gods. The temples were the great consumers of it. The cult statues were sheathed in it. The vessels of the offering ritual were cast of it. The ceremonial weapons that hung in the inner sanctuaries were inlaid with it. When a Sumerian king brought back a great hoard of gold from a successful military campaign, the standard practice was not to enrich himself or his court. The standard practice was to dedicate it, by formal inscription, to the temple of his city's patron deity. The gold flowed up the hierarchy. It moved from the mines, in places we cannot now identify, through the long-distance trade routes, into the cities of the plain, and from the cities into the temples, and from the temples into the inner sanctuaries, where it was placed at the feet or upon the bodies of the gods. And it is here, with the gold moving in a single great current from the distant mountains to the divine treasuries, that the question of this documentary begins to take its actual shape. What if the labour that humanity was created to perform was, at least in part, this labour? What if the work of the canal and the field, which the Atrahasis epic places at the centre of the story, was only one face of a larger system? What if, when we read the tablets carefully, we are looking at the record of an arrangement in which a class of beings, the senior gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, ordered the creation of a working population, placed them upon a particular land, gave them, through their teachers the apkallu, the arts of agriculture and writing and law and metallurgy, and then directed, through the institution of the temple, the flow of the most precious of those metals, gold, upward, toward themselves? That is a question this story has to ask honestly. It is also a question that requires care, because there is a popular form of the question, widely circulated, that goes well beyond what the texts themselves describe. And there is a more cautious form of the question, less spectacular, but more interesting, that the texts do support. Now let us look at both of them in turn. The popular form of the question takes us back to a series of books that began appearing in the mid-1970s, written by a businessman and amateur translator named Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin was born in 1920 in what was then Soviet Azerbaijan. He grew up in Mandatory Palestine. He studied economics in London. He spent most of his working life as a journalist and editor in Israel and the United States. And in the last decades of his career, beginning with a book titled The 12th Planet, published by Stein and Day in 1976, he developed an interpretation of the Sumerian texts that has reached a vastly larger audience than any academic Assyriologist has ever achieved. I want to give Sitchin a fair hearing, not because I agree with his conclusions, but because he was a serious reader, in his own way, of texts that very few people in the popular imagination had ever heard of. He was responsible more than any other single figure for putting the word Anunnaki into the vocabulary of millions of people who would otherwise never have encountered Mesopotamian literature in their lives. The fact that you and I are sitting here tonight with the names Eridu and Nippur and Atrahasis on our lips is, in some indirect way, partly because of him. That deserves to be acknowledged. Sitchin's central claim, developed across the dozen volumes of his Earth Chronicles series, was this. The Anunnaki, he argued, were a race of extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, which travelled on an elongated orbit through the outer solar system and crossed near Earth approximately every 3,600 years. The Anunnaki, he said, had come to Earth in the deep past to mine gold. The gold was needed, he proposed, to repair their failing atmosphere on Nibiru. They mined initially in southeastern Africa. When the labour became unbearable for the lesser gods, the Igigi, they revolted, and the senior Anunnaki, working through Enki and the mother goddess, engineered Homo sapiens by genetic modification of an existing hominid in order to take over the mining work. This is, in a single paragraph, the story that has propagated through countless documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube channels for 50 years. It is the story that, in some form, has probably reached you before tonight, whether you sort it out or not. Now let us look at what the texts themselves actually say. The word Nibiru appears in the cuneiform corpus. This is true. It is an Akkadian word, Neberu, derived from a root that means to cross, to ford, to pass over. In the astronomical compendium known as Mul, Apin, compiled in approximately the 8th or 9th century before the Common Era, and preserved in copies from later Assyrian and Babylonian libraries, Neberu is identified as a name for the planet Jupiter, specifically when Jupiter is at a particular position relative to the celestial equator. In other texts, the same word is used for the constellation we now call Aries, or for a star near the zenith at midwinter. The German Assyriologist Hermann Hunger and the American historian of science David Pingree, in their authoritative 1999 study, Astral Sciences in Mesopotamia, examined every occurrence of Neberu in the surviving astronomical literature. They concluded that it never, in any text, refers to a planet beyond the 7 known to ancient astronomy. Sitchin's Nibiru, the planet on the long orbit, the planet of the Anunnaki, does not appear in the cuneiform record at all. It was an inference drawn by Sitchin from cylinder seal imagery and from his own translations of certain passages, and disputed in detail by every qualified Assyriologist who has examined his work. The most thorough textual rebuttal was assembled by the late Michael S. Heiser, an American scholar of Hebrew and Semitic languages, who died in 2023. Heiser took Sitchin's specific translations, line by line, and compared them to the published lexicons of Akkadian and Sumerian. He showed with the patience of a man who knew the languages that the word Sitchin translated as planet usually meant something else, a deity, a star, a constellation, a directional marker. He showed that the word translated as rocket or Shem could be matched to a much simpler ancient meaning, having to do with name or designation. He showed that the celestial events Sitchin reconstructed from individual cuneiform signs did not survive a careful reading of the texts in which those signs appeared. I am not raising these objections to embarrass anyone who has found Sitchin's books meaningful. The books are vividly written. They take a body of difficult material and they turn it into an adventure. They give a reader the feeling that the world is stranger and more interesting than the textbooks have admitted. That feeling is not in itself wrong. It is a feeling that we should keep, in fact, as we work through the harder version of the same question. But the specific claim that the Anunnaki were aliens from a 10th planet who mined gold in southern Africa with engineered human labourers is not a claim that the tablets make. The tablets say, in the passages we have already read, that humanity was created to dig canals, to carry the basket of irrigation, to till the fields, to ease the labour of the lesser gods, to maintain the temples, and to provide the daily offerings to the senior gods. The word for mine, in the technical sense of extracting ore from a shaft in the earth, does not occur in the creation passages of Atrahasis or Enuma Elish or Enki and Ninmah. The word for gold occurs elsewhere in the cuneiform corpus, but it does not occur in those passages. The two ideas were joined by Sitchin in 1976. They are not joined in the texts themselves, so that is the popular form of the question. It is a form that has reached enormous influence, and it is a form that, on careful examination, the cuneiform record does not support. Now let us turn to the cautious form, because the cautious form is, in my view, more interesting, more haunting, more worth our time. What the texts do support is this. The Sumerians believed, in a tradition preserved across 2,000 years of cuneiform writing, that they had been created to perform labour on behalf of a class of beings they called the Anunna. The labour included the digging of canals, the cultivation of grain, the maintenance of cities, the construction and adornment of temples, and the regular offering of food, drink, and precious materials to the divine images that resided in those temples. The texts further state that this class of beings, the Anunna, did not allow humanity to invent civilization on its own. They directed humanity through a series of 7 messengers, the apkallu, who came up out of the water at the dawn of history and taught the arts. Among the arts taught was the working of gold. The texts further indicate that gold flowed, by a consistent pattern, from the distant mountain regions of the east, through trade and military expedition, into the cities of the alluvial plain, and from the cities into the temple treasuries. The temple treasuries were not simply storehouses of wealth, they were the operational accounts of the gods. The gold was used to sheath the divine statues. The gold was used to cast the ceremonial vessels of the offering ritual. The gold was the material substance through which a Sumerian believed his city's god was honoured, dressed, fed, and made present. Now hold these 3 observations together for a moment. A working population, created for labour, by divine decree. A class of teachers, the apkallu, who arrive from outside and instruct the labour force in the arts, including metalworking. A persistent, organised flow of the most precious of metals from distant sources, up through the social hierarchy, into the sanctuaries of the gods. This is what the cuneiform record actually describes. It does not describe spacecraft. It does not describe genetic engineering laboratories. It does not describe a 10th planet on an elongated orbit. What it describes is an arrangement, articulated with extraordinary consistency across many centuries, in which a created population is set to work, taught by emissaries from outside, and made to direct the flow of valuable goods upward toward beings the population believed to be of an order above their own. Whether those beings actually existed in the form the Sumerians described, whether they were physical entities or psychological projections or memories of an earlier human civilization, or something else entirely, is a question the texts do not answer. The texts simply assume the framework. They write within it. They never argue for it, because for a Sumerian scribe, the framework was not in question. What moves me about this when I consider it carefully, in the lamplight of an ordinary evening, is how cleanly the cautious version stands, without any need for embellishment. The flying machines and the genetic laboratories and the distant homeworld are not necessary. The texts are already strange enough. They are already telling us that the founders of our civilization believed they had been made for work. They are already telling us that the work was directed by beings whose identity they could name, but whose origin they could not fully describe. They are already telling us that the rewards of the work flowed away from the workers and towards something or someone else. These are claims that can stand on their own. They do not require a planet beyond Pluto to make them disquieting. Let us spend a moment with the question of who, in the Sumerian conception, the Anunna actually were. The word, as we have seen, breaks down into the Sumerian elements A, meaning seed or offspring, and Nun, meaning prince or noble one. The Anunna are the offspring of the prince. The prince in question, in the earliest layers of the tradition, is An, the sky god, the high god of the cuneiform pantheon, the deity who in formal lists sits at the top and from whom all other gods descend. So the Anunna, etymologically, are simply the children of the sky, the seed of An, the descendants of the highest god. In the earliest texts, the word seems to apply to the full body of the divine assembly. It is a comprehensive term. The Anunna are the gods. Over time, the word narrows. By the Old Babylonian period, when Atrahasis was composed in the form we now have it, the Anunna are distinguished from the Igigi. The Anunna are the senior gods who make decrees, and the Igigi are the junior gods who do the labour. By the Middle Babylonian period, the distinction shifts again. The Anunnaki, in some texts, come to be associated with the gods of the underworld, the judges of the dead, while the Igigi rise into the heavenly assembly. The labels migrate, the hierarchies reshape themselves to fit changing theological needs. What does not change is the foundational claim, the claim that there exists a body of beings descended from the sky god who exist in an ordered relation to one another, who occupy a structure of command, and who direct, through their decisions, the labour of humanity. The Dutch Assyriologist Frans Wigeman, in his contribution to the 1995 reference volume, Civilizations of the Ancient Near East, traced these terminological shifts across 2,000 years of texts. He noted that the line between Anunnaki and Igigi can move from one period to the next, but the overall structure, the structure of senior decree makers and junior labourers, of upward flowing offerings and downward flowing commands, remained constant. The vocabulary shifted, the architecture did not. It is the architecture that should hold our attention. The architecture is what the tablets describe most consistently. The architecture is what survived the wars, and the invasions and the linguistic substitutions. A people lives upon the alluvial plain. The people works. The work produces grain, and bricks and woven cloth, and worked metal. The grain is gathered into the temples. The metal is gathered into the temples. The cloth is gathered into the temples. From the temples, the offerings are dispatched, and the dispatch goes upward in a vertical direction toward whatever the people understood the gods to be. Now let us consider one further wrinkle in this picture, because there is a question that the careful reader might want to ask at this point. And it is a question worth pausing on. If the offerings flow upward, what does the upward direction actually mean? The Sumerians lived in a flat landscape. The plain stretches for hundreds of kilometres in every direction. The horizon is low. The sky is enormous. When the offerings rose from the temple, where in the Sumerian imagination did they actually go? The texts answer this in different ways at different times. In the most archaic stratum, the gods seem to live in the cities themselves. The statue is the god, the temple is the god's house. The offering is consumed, in some literal sense, by the god who resides in the building. In a slightly later stratum, the gods are spread out across the visible world. An, the sky god, lives in the sky. Enki lives in the Absu, the freshwater abyss beneath the marshland. Enlil lives at Nippur, in his temple Ekur, which is sometimes described as a mountain, even though no mountain exists in the plain. The earth goddess Ki lives in the earth itself. In a still later stratum, the one we find fully developed in the Babylonian and Assyrian periods, the gods are increasingly identified with the heavenly bodies. Anu becomes associated with the celestial pole. Enlil becomes associated with the constellations that cross the zenith. Enki becomes associated with a constellation in the southern sky. Ishtar becomes the planet Venus. Nergal becomes Mars. Marduk becomes Jupiter. The pantheon, in this later phase, is mapped onto the sky. This is the phase in which the word Neberu, the word Sitchin, would seize upon 2.5 millennia later, takes its astronomical meanings. By the time we reach Mul Apin in the 8th century before the Common Era, the gods are coordinates. The gods are positions in the night sky. The gods are observable from any rooftop in Babylon. What this means for our reading of the older texts is that we should be careful about projecting the later astronomical framework back onto the earlier, mythological one. The Anunna of Atrahasis are not, in the original composition, primarily celestial bodies. They are senior gods of an unspecified location, named in a fixed assembly, debating the labour problem on behalf of the cosmos. Where they live, in the original conception, is not made specific. They are simply above. They are simply elsewhere. They are simply the ones who decide. This is, in some ways, a more uncomfortable picture than the Sitchin version. The Sitchin version locates the gods on a specific planet, with a specific atmosphere, on a specific orbit. It is, in its way, a reassuring location. It is somewhere we could, in principle, visit. The older Sumerian conception does not give us that comfort. The Anunna are simply the prior order. They are the ones who were there before we were. They issued the decrees, they held the me, they sent the apkallu. They are not located. And yet they shape, through the tablets that have come down to us, almost everything about how the Sumerians understood their existence. Now let us return to the central question of the story. If the cuneiform record describes humanity as a created labour force, and if the labour included the maintenance of temples and the offering of precious metals, and if the precious metals flowed in a regular current from distant mountains into the divine sanctuaries, then what kind of arrangement exactly are we looking at? Is it a religion in the sense we use the word today? Is it a memory, however distorted, of an earlier political reality? Is it something else entirely, something for which we do not yet have a category? Let us hold these three possibilities in mind as we proceed. Now let us take each of these in turn, slowly, with care. The first possibility, that the Sumerian framework was a religion, in the sense we use the word today, runs into difficulty almost immediately. The word religion is itself a relatively late construction. It comes from the Latin religio, which the Romans used in a particular and somewhat narrow sense. The medieval Christians refined it. The Enlightenment thinkers turned it into a category that could be applied across cultures, an object of study, a thing one could be a scholar of. By the 19th century, when European archaeologists first began to read the cuneiform tablets, religion had become a word that named a separate sphere of human activity. A sphere concerned with belief, with worship, with the relationship between the individual soul and the divine. The Sumerians had no such word. They had no such category. What we now call their religion was, for them, simply the structure of the world. The gods were not figures one could believe in or not believe in, the way a modern person might believe or not believe in a particular doctrine. They were the named owners of the lands and the waters. They were the legal proprietors of the cities. Enki owned the Abzu. Enlil owned the wind. Inanna owned Uruk. The priests were not, in our sense, religious functionaries. They were the household staff of beings whose households happened to be the great temples at the centre of the city. This means that when we read about the offerings flowing into the temples of Mesopotamia, we should not picture something like a Sunday collection plate or a voluntary tithe. We should picture something closer to a property tax. The offering was not optional. It was the lawful tribute owed to the owner of the city, on whose land the citizen lived, on whose water the citizen's barley grew. The Sumerian word for the regular offering, say-dug, carries the sense of an established delivery, a fixed obligation, not a spontaneous gift. The temple was an estate. The god was the landlord. The citizen was, in part, a tenant. So if we ask whether the Sumerian system was religion as we know it, the answer is no. It was something both more concrete and more comprehensive. It was an economic and legal arrangement, made cosmic, in which the entire labour of a civilization was understood to be owed, by deep right, to a category of beings the civilization could name but could not see. Now let us turn to the second possibility, the possibility that what the tablets describe is a distorted memory of an earlier political reality. This proposal has actually been entertained, in carefully hedged forms, by serious scholars. Thorkild Jacobsen, in his 1976 book The Treasures of Darkness, suggested that the Mesopotamian pantheon could be read in part as a memory of the political structures of the late prehistoric period. The senior gods, he proposed, may have been the deified figures of an earlier authority, an authority whose existence was so foundational, so taken for granted, that by the time the cuneiform script was invented, those figures had become not historical persons, but cosmic ones. In this reading, the Anunna would not be aliens, and they would not be purely religious abstractions. They would be the memory of human or human-like rulers, perhaps of a different cultural origin from the Sumerian-speaking population, whose actual identities had been forgotten, but whose role in shaping the early agricultural societies of the southern plain had been preserved in mythological form. Memory, in this reading, hardens into theology over centuries, the way a fluid hardens into stone. It is worth pausing on this idea because it has consequences. The Mesopotamian plain has in fact always been a place where populations layered on top of one another. The earliest occupants of the southern alluvium spoke a language we do not know, a language that left its trace in certain Sumerian vocabulary, particularly the words for agricultural tools and crops, but which has never been recovered as a complete tongue. The Sumerians who came after, who first wrote the cuneiform script around 3200 before the Common Era, were already speaking of an earlier order. They did not present themselves as the originators of civilization. They presented themselves as the inheritors of one. What had they inherited from? From whom? The Sumerian texts answer this question with the names of gods. But Jacobson's hypothesis suggests that the names of gods may, in some cases, have been the names of forgotten predecessors. Predecessors who built the first canals, dug the first irrigation channels, established the first temples, before the people we now call Sumerians arrived to find the system already in place and ascribe its design to figures of a higher order. I am not asserting that this is what happened. I am noting that this is a hypothesis some careful scholars have held with care, and that it accounts for certain features of the text that other theories struggle to explain. Why, after all, did the Sumerians need a category for senior decree-making beings, distinct from a category for junior labouring beings? Why was the labour relation such a foundational element of the cosmology? Why did the texts insist again and again that humanity was made specifically to relieve the work of a prior population? One answer is that there had been a prior population, and the memory of that arrangement, refined and elevated and shaped over 1,000 years of retelling, became the divine framework that the cuneiform record preserves. Now let us turn to the third possibility, the possibility that what the tablets describe is something for which we do not yet have a category at all. This is the most uncomfortable proposal, and it is, I confess, the one I find myself returning to most often when I sit alone with these texts late at night. When we encounter a phenomenon for which our existing categories do not fit, the temptation is to force it into the nearest available category. We call it religion, or we call it political memory, or we call it, as Sitchin did, an extraterrestrial encounter. Each of these moves resolves the discomfort of unfamiliarity. Each of these moves places the strange material into a box we already know how to handle. And each of these moves, in doing so, risks losing something the material's actually trying to convey. What if the Sumerians knew of something that we have, in the intervening 5,000 years, forgotten how to perceive? What if the Anunna were neither aliens nor deified ancestors, nor mere projections of the priestly imagination, but a feature of human experience that was once available to a great civilization and is no longer available to us? The texts describe encounter. The texts describe instruction. The texts describe ongoing relation. They are not philosophical speculations about a distant divinity. They are accounts of contact. The question of what kind of contact, with what kind of being, is a question the tablets pose but do not answer in any way we can fully decode. We are reading the records of a people who took for granted what we cannot even formulate. Their unspoken assumptions are our missing pieces. They wrote what was, for them, obvious, and the obvious does not need to be explained. The obvious is the silent ground upon which the text stands. What moves me about this, what holds me when I read these passages late and let the rest of the world go quiet, is the recognition that we are not, in any meaningful sense, the inheritors of the Sumerian worldview. We have inherited their writing system. We have inherited their mathematics. We have inherited their irrigation methods, their legal codes in modified form, their calendar in the divisions of the hour and the degree. We have not inherited their cosmology. Their cosmology lived inside a way of seeing the world that did not survive the long transition from cuneiform civilization to alphabetic civilization, from temple economy to commercial economy, from divine kingship to the modern state. We hold the artifacts. We do not hold the framework that made the artifacts make sense. This is not an argument for abandoning the categories we have. It is an argument for holding them lightly. for acknowledging that when we read the tablets, we are reading a fragment of something larger, something whose full shape we cannot reconstruct from the fragment alone. The Anunna may have been one thing for the scribes of Eridu, another thing for the scribes of Nippur, a third thing for the priests who served them, and a fourth thing entirely from the perspective of whatever the Anunna actually were, considered apart from the perceptions of those who recorded them. We are looking, across an enormous distance, at a phenomenon we cannot fully perceive, recorded by a people whose perceptual world we cannot fully share, in a script we are still learning to read. Now, before we leave the question, let us return once more to the thread of gold. Because the gold persists, it runs through everything we have considered tonight. The gold of Arata, the gold of the temple sanctuaries, the gold that sheathed the divine images, the gold that flowed, in measured tribute, up the river systems of the Tigris and the Euphrates, from the mountains of the east, through the cities of the plain, into the Holy of Holies, where the eyes of the citizen could not follow it. The cuneiform texts do not say that the Anunna mined this gold using engineered human labourers in southern Africa. The texts say that the Anunna received this gold, that humanity gave it, that the giving was not optional, but built into the structure of the world, that the structure existed before any individual was born and would continue after any individual died, and that the work of one's life was, in part, to participate in the maintenance of that flow. If we step back from all the theories of who or what the Anunna may have been, we are left with this. A civilization that lasted 3,000 years organised itself around the principle that the most valuable substance in the visible world was owed by deep cosmic right to beings of a higher order, and the civilization performed this owing. It built the temples, it cast the statues, it carried the metal up the steps, it set the gold before the divine image, and considered the transaction completed. We do not perform this owing any longer. We have forgotten the recipient. But the buildings remain. The foundations are still in the earth, at Eridu, at Nippur, at Uruk, at Ur. And the gold, where it has survived the millennia, and the looters, and the wars, sits in our museums now, behind glass with small explanatory labels next to it, read by visitors who do not understand, in any deep sense, what they are looking at. I sometimes wonder, when I stand in such galleries in the hour before the museum closes, when the visitors have thinned out, and the light through the high windows has begun to slant low across the cases, whether the object itself, the artifact, retains some residue of its original purpose, whether it remembers, in whatever way an object can remember, that it was made for a recipient, whether it is, in some sense, still waiting. That is a fanciful thought, and I am aware that it is. I do not assert that gold has memory, or that artifacts wait. I note only that when we encounter these objects, we are encountering things made within a worldview that is no longer ours, and that the worldview itself was not arbitrary. It was a coherent system, sustained for thousands of years, organised around the conviction that the most precious materials of the earth belonged elsewhere, belonged upward, belonged to beings whom the Sumerians had received, taught, and named. Now let us prepare to bring our long walk through the tablets toward its close, because we have tonight travelled a long distance. We have stood in the museum, and we have read the prism. We have counted the impossible reigns of the antediluvian kings. We have walked into the temple at Eridu and counted the 18 levels. We have heard the Igigi shout for relief in the night, and we have watched the mother goddess pinch off 14 pieces of clay. We have looked briefly and carefully at the popular story of the Anunnaki and at what the careful reading of the actual texts allows us to say. What we have not done, and what no reading of the tablets can do for us, is resolve the question. The question remains open. It was left open by the scribes who composed the texts. It was left open by the priests who recited them. It was left open by the kings who commissioned the copies for their libraries. And it is left open for us, in this hour, listening to the names of beings whose true nature was not entirely transparent, even to the people who first wrote those names down. And yet, despite this openness, there is something the texts will not let us look away from, something that sits at the centre of all our considerations tonight, like the gold of Arata sitting in the temple sanctuaries of Uruk. The texts insist, with a quiet persistence across millennia, that humanity was made for a purpose, not for itself, not for its own flourishing, not for the lonely improvisations of a creature that arose by accident and must invent its own meaning, but for the relief of another labour, for the maintenance of another household, for the transport of valuable things from one location to another, from the lower order to the higher. This is not a comfortable proposition for a modern listener. Our cultural inheritance, shaped by the philosophies of the 18th and 19th centuries, prefers a different account of our origins. We prefer to be the protagonists of our own story. We prefer to be the figures around whom the cosmos arranges itself, or alternatively, the figures who arrange a cosmos that does not particularly care about us. We do not, by and large, prefer to be the figures who exist on someone else's behalf, and yet the cuneiform record is unambiguous on this point. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, across 3,000 years and 4 languages, the texts return again and again to the same proposition. We were made to bear the basket. We were made to dig the canal. We were made to grow the barley that fed the temple. We were made to carry the metals from the mountains and place them, with care, in the inner sanctuary, where the divine image waited. The proposition is consistent. The proposition is repeated. The proposition is foundational. And the proposition is, by any honest reading, what the texts say. What we do with that proposition is up to us. We can call it religion and place it in our museums, as we have done. We can call it political memory and trace its lines back to forgotten predecessors, as Jacobson carefully suggested in 1976. We can call it the residue of an actual encounter, as Sitchin too quickly proposed, or we can hold it as what it is, on its own terms, before our interpretations begin. A claim made by a civilization that lasted longer than any civilization currently alive. A claim that the work of human existence is not, in the end, its own. Now let us turn for the last time to the museum. It is, by my reckoning, very near closing hour now in Oxford. The day has been long, the visitors have thinned, the fluorescent lights of the Ashmolean galleries still hum, but with a slightly different quality at this hour, as the natural light through the high windows withdraws and the artificial light takes over the cases. The Weld Blundell prism sits where it sat at the beginning of this hour. It has not moved. It will not move. It has been in this museum since 1923. It will, barring catastrophe, be in this museum long after every person currently looking at it has gone. The 4 faces of the prism still hold their columns of cuneiform. The columns still hold the names of the kings of Eridu, the kings of Bad Tibira, the kings of Larak, the kings of Sippa, the kings of Shurapak. The names are still there. Alulim, who reigned 28,800 years. En-men-lu-ana, who reigned 43,200. The numbers are still there in their impossible scale, and the line marking the flood is still there, where the scribe at Larsa around 1800 before the Common Era recorded that the deluge came, and that after the deluge, kingship descended again from heaven. Someone, somewhere in the building, is reading these names now. A student, perhaps, who has come to the gallery between lectures, who is looking at the prism for the first time, and trying to place it in the longer story they are being taught about the rise of human civilization. Or a tourist who has wandered up from the ground floor and does not quite know what they are looking at, only that it is old and that it is small, and that the explanatory card next to the case describes it as one of the most important historical documents in the museum. Or perhaps no one at all, just now, just at this minute. Perhaps the gallery is empty, and the prism is alone in its case, with the names of its kings, waiting for the next visitor. I have stood in that gallery myself, at hours close to this one, and I will tell you what moves me when I do. What moves me is not the size of the numbers, though the size of the numbers is striking. What moves me is not the lost civilization, the prism documents, though the loss of that civilization is a long and quiet grief. What moves me when I stand close enough to the case to see the individual strokes of the stylus is the simple fact of the writing itself. Someone, 4,000 years ago, in a city now reduced to a low mound in the Iraqi alluvium, sat at a small table and pressed a reed into wet clay. And the reed marked the clay, and the clay was fired, and the fired clay was placed in a structure, and the structure collapsed, and the clay was buried, and the burial preserved the clay, against all the odds of 3 millennia, until a British expedition working at Larsa in 1922 found it again and lifted it from the ground. That sequence of events is, by any reasonable measure, improbable. That the writing should have been done, that the writing should have survived, that the writing should have been found, that the writing should have been read. And yet here we are, you and I, 4,000 years downstream of the scribe's small table, considering what the writing means, What moves me, I think, is the faithfulness of it. The faithfulness of the clay, the faithfulness of the script, the faithfulness of the names that the scribe took the trouble to write down, names that he did not need to write down, names that would have been forgotten without him, names that now exist in the world because he existed in his world and chose to record them. The Sumerians, as best we can tell, did not have a clear conception of what we would call posterity in the modern sense. They did not necessarily expect to be read 4,000 years later by curious wanderers in a different language, on a different continent, in an age of devices they could not have imagined. They wrote because writing was what their gods had given them to do. They wrote because the names of the kings needed to be on the prism, and the names of the cities needed to be on the prism, and the order of things needed to be preserved. They wrote because the me, the decreed forms of civilization, included the act of writing. The act of writing was itself one of the gifts of Enki. To write was to participate in the order. To leave the marks was to honour the marks. And yet, as a side effect of their fidelity, they reached us, across an enormous distance, across the rise and fall of empires they could not have imagined, across the development of alphabets and printing presses and digital archives, none of which they had any conception of. They reached us. And tonight, in whatever city you happen to be listening from, we have read them. That is something. That is not nothing. That is, when I sit with it, almost everything. I want to thank you, before we close, for staying with me through this long walk. 2 hours is a long time to sit with anything, in a world that does not particularly encourage us to sit with things. The civilization of distraction does not need our attention to its tablets. It is not paid by the minute we give to the work of remembering, and yet you have given those minutes. You have stayed. You have walked with me from the Ashmolean to the Agigi's revolt, to the temple at Eridu, to the gold of Arata, to the careful question of who or what the Anunna actually were. If this story stayed with you, a like helps other wanderers find this quiet place. The algorithm of the platform we use to meet here is not particularly kind to slow material. It is not particularly kind to 2-hour considerations of cuneiform tablets. It rewards what is loud and quick and certain. The small gesture of a like is, in its way, an argument against that. It is a small vote, cast quietly, for the proposition that there is still room in our attention for things that take their time. There is more waiting for you in the playlist. Other tablets, other names, other lines that nobody has yet translated into any modern tongue, that sit in the storerooms of museums and the basements of universities, waiting for someone in some future decade to turn them over and read them again. The work of reading these texts is not finished. The work of understanding the Sumerians is not finished. The work of asking what the Anunna may have been, and what humanity may have been to them, and what we may yet recover from their long, careful documentation of their relationship. That work has barely begun. The Sumerians wrote because they wanted to be read. 4,000 years later, we are still reading them. The conversation is not over. The Weld Blundell prism, in its glass case in the Ashmolean Museum, has heard nothing of all this. It does not know that we have been speaking of it. It does not know that, in some apartment or kitchen or quiet room, in some city in some country, you have been listening to its kings and its numbers, and the names of its drowned cities. It sits where it has always sat. It will sit where it will always sit, until the day, far in the future, when even the Ashmolean is gone, and the prism is found again by some new excavation, in some unimaginable later age, by hands that may not be entirely like ours. But for now, in this hour, the prism is there. The columns are still on it. The names are still on it. The reign of Alulim, 28,800 years, is still on it. The line marking the flood is still on it. And the small scribe who pressed the reed into the clay still exists in the world, in his way, in the fact that we have just now considered his work together. Somewhere, right now, someone is reading the names of the kings of Eridu. Someone, somewhere, is bringing those names back into the light of attention. Perhaps it is the student in the gallery. Perhaps it is the scholar in the storeroom. Perhaps it is you, in the quiet of your own hour, hearing them spoken aloud for the first time. The names did not survive 5,000 years to be forgotten. They survived to be carried forward. The clay outlasted the city. The city outlasted the kings. The kings outlasted, in this strange way, even the gods who decreed them, since the names of the gods are now read mostly in museums, and the names of the kings are read in the same museums, side by side. The rulers and the ruled, the labourers and the decree makers, gathered together at last in the same display case. Whether the Anunna were aliens or deified ancestors, or something for which we have no category, the texts they left behind have done what texts do. They have waited. They have endured. They have in the end found readers. Thank you for staying with me through this story. The tablet is still there, in the case, in Oxford. The names are still on it. Someone, somewhere, is reading them right now.